Hello everyone, I'm Justin and this is every movie and series in the Marvel Cinematic Universe ranked from worst to best. Real quick, if you're watching this video and you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. With Spider-Man No Way Home and Hawkeye Season 1 rounding out the MCU releases for 2021, we've decided to take a look back at every MCU film and series since 2008 and see which ones were the best and which ones were the worst. We don't actually think anything in the MCU is bad, but some installments are substantially better than others. Of course, this video is just for fun and it's okay if our rankings are completely different from yours. At number 32, we have Thor: The Dark World, released in 2013. I'll start off by saying I've always enjoyed the scenes on Asgard between Thor, Loki, Frigga, and Odin, but they come few and far between, especially in this movie. There's a lot of time focusing on Jane, and to me her character isn't that interesting and can come off as annoying at times. The villain of this film, Malekith, is also one of the most boring of the MCU, and the final fight with them going in and out of portals just drags on way too long. All of the Loki stuff was great though, especially the scene where he reveals his true grief over Frigga's death, and when he uses the form of Captain America has got to be one of the funniest moments in the entire MCU. At number 31, we have The Falcon and the Winter Soldier Season 1, released in 2021. I really liked the central themes and characters in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but at times, specifically in the finale, things did feel rushed. But I do think there's a lot to like about this series, and I personally really enjoyed the growth in the relationship between Sam and Bucky. I felt that Sam definitely needed more character growth before becoming Captain America, and this series does a good job of using his relationship with Steve and Bucky to build him up. I also liked seeing Zemo return since I'd already really enjoyed him in Civil War, and John Walker was in my opinion a very interesting character that I definitely like to see more of in the future. However, I didn't care for Carly and the Flag Smashers. It felt like the show didn't know if they wanted us to sympathize or dislike Carly, but I couldn't have cared less about her, to be honest. Also, I feel like the whole side plot involving Bucky and Yori was never really given a meaningful payoff, and I honestly don't know why it was in the show. And although it was obvious from her first appearance in the show, Sharon Carter being the power broker to me didn't really make sense based on how her character had been used in previous MCU projects. But even with its negatives, Falcon and the Winter Soldier is definitely not a bad show, and if you enjoy having Sam and Bucky on screen, then you should definitely check it out. Number 30, we have Captain Marvel, released in 2019. The main issue I have with Captain Marvel is that the main protagonist wasn't very likable, with her ego overshadowing her vulnerability. But young Nick Fury was a great addition and is a nice change from the usual cynical version of him we see in the rest of the series. The villain is okay, but nothing groundbreaking, and the introduction and inclusion of the Skrulls are a nice decoy from the main story. But I can't shake my indifference over Carol throughout the film. Number 29, we have The Incredible Hulk, released in 2008. This movie is a darker story compared to the rest of the MCU, but I honestly like the change of pace. This movie also features Edward Norton in the titular role before he had been replaced by Mark Ruffalo, and although I prefer Ruffalo as Hulk, I actually really enjoy Norton's performance. The story is pretty basic, but is still a well laid out origin story for the character, and the supervillain Emil Blonsky and his alter ego Abomination, played by Tim Roth, holds up with any other MCU villain, as well as the final fight between him and Hulk. It's a shame that the story built in this film was seemingly abandoned throughout the rest of the MCU, but nonetheless it's a worthwhile watch. Number 28, we have What If Season 1, released in 2021. What If had some episodes that I consider to be as good as anything in the MCU, specifically episode 4, as well as some episodes that weren't anything special, so it's definitely a mixed bag. But I really enjoy how it changes crucial moments in the MCU and shows how different things could really be. Going into the series, I didn't expect each episode to actually tie into one another, and I was pleasantly surprised to see a unique Avengers team up by the end of it against an even more OP Ultron. Seeing variants of Black Panther, Thor, Doctor Strange, and even Peggy Carter and Killmonger was great, as well as the introduction of the Watcher, and I'm interested to see how the Watcher or other Watchers will impact the MCU. The artwork for this series is also very good, and it allowed them to create some visuals that maybe wouldn't look as good in live action. And this series as a whole is just a lot different from what you normally see in the MCU, which adds to its charm for me. Number 27, we have Thor, released in 2011. Another story of a great villain but an unlikable hero. Thor is arrogant and dumb, while Loki's character is much more compelling and is easy to empathize with. But I honestly do enjoy this movie a lot. Thor's character grows on me by the end, and as I already said, Loki is amazing. All the scenes on Asgard are captivating, and it makes me wish they had spent more time there than on Earth with Darcy and Jane. Although Dr. Selvig is a top tier side character. But there's nothing too bad about this movie, except for maybe Thor's bleach blonde eyebrows. At number 26, we have Iron Man 2, released in 2010. The worst of the 3 Iron Man films to me is the sequel. Robert Downey Jr. and the rest of this great cast did the best they could with what they were given, but in the end they were left with a rushed and inconsequential film. There was great relationship building between Pepper and Tony, as well as the story thread about him and his father. We also meet Black Widow in this movie, and I really enjoyed the stuff between her, Fury, Tony, and Happy. But even with its faults, this is definitely still an enjoyable watch. Number 25, we have Iron Man 3, released in 2013. Iron Man 3 was, in my opinion, a very good movie, and it being ranked so low just goes to show how great a majority of the MCU is. Robert Downey Jr. is great as always, and I really enjoyed seeing Tony Stark using his smarts to his advantage, being without his suit for a large portion of this film. And the continued build of his relationship with Pepper is great, and they're probably a top 3 MCU couple for me. Aldrich Killian was a pretty solid villain in my opinion, and I think the fake Mandarin, Trevor Slattery, was really funny, and I was glad to see him return in Shang-Chi Shang-Chi, but I'll come back to that in a bit. Although I think this film could maybe feel unnecessary when looking at the MCU as a whole, it's still a great movie on its own and continues to add to Tony's character arc. At number 24, we have Hawkeye Season 1, released in 2021. Here we have a show that started off really great, but the ending felt rushed, with me wanting a bit more than what we got. I think that the Daredevil Netflix series is amongst the best of what Marvel has put out since the emergence of Marvel movies and shows, so I was very excited to see Vincent D'Onofrio as Kingpin, the main antagonist of that show, joining the MCU. But it ended with him being rushed into a story that he didn't really need to be a part of. Kate Bishop's character was just a little too annoying at the start for me, but she did grow on me as the show came to a conclusion. The tracksuits, Yelena, and Echo were all really entertaining antagonists, especially Yelena, whose story was the most compelling of the whole show. Unfortunately for me, Jack and Eleanor's characters didn't live up to their potential either, which leaves this show being good, but it could have been great. Number 23, we have Black Widow, released in 2021. Scarlett Johansson had been deserving of her own solo film for years before she finally got it with the release of Black Widow, and she put together a great performance alongside her co-star Florence Pugh as Yelena Belova, who was personally my favorite character of the whole film. Although we had never heard of Yelena in previous MCU installments, they were still able to build a sisterly bond between her and Natasha in just this film that you could really connect with. It was interesting to learn more about Black Widow's life before joining S.H.I.E.L.D. and how she became a top-tier assassin, as well as the people that trained and tortured her in the Red Room. I think the villains were pretty good, and although I don't think they used Taskmaster as well as they should have, it doesn't bother me too much how the character was used in this film either. But one thing I really do appreciate about this film is how it was able to give a final chapter to one character while introducing another. Number 22, we have Eternals, released in 2021. I think Marvel had a difficult task giving us an Eternals origin story after everything that went down from phases 1 to 3, but to me, Eternals turned out to be a very enjoyable film. Each of the 10 Eternals felt fleshed out, and I really enjoyed the relationships built between them, specifically the relationship between Gilgamesh, who's definitely one of my top 3 favorite Eternals, and Thena. My other 2 favorite Eternals were Kingo, along with his valet Karun, and Icarus, who I wasn't that interested in for the first third of the movie, but he really won me over by the end, and I think he was one of the best MCU villains if you consider him a villain, which I do. This was also a beautiful film with some very nice visuals and impressive fight scenes that did a good job of showcasing each of their powers. Although I do wish Kingo would have been a part of the final fight rather than sitting it out, which I felt was a bit odd, but the ending as a whole was pretty good, and I'm very interested to see what happens with the Eternals and the Celestials next, as well as the impact Arrows will have in the MCU. At number 21, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp, released in 2018. I think this is one of the more forgotten MCU installments, but I really enjoyed it, and I think it deserves to be talked about more often than it is. Paul Rudd as Ant-Man is of course hilarious, and I think this film builds off of the first Ant-Man in Civil War very well and leads into Avengers Endgame perfectly. I like that we really get to learn more about the Quantum Realm through Hank and Hope's quest to find Hope's mother Janet, and I think Ghost was a really interesting villain that I really did sympathize with, and I would definitely like to see more of her in the future. And Hank, Hope, and Janet's disappearance due to Thanos' snap was perfectly done, and I'm really interested to see how Scott, Hank, Hope, and Janet will handle their return after the blip. At number 20, we have Avengers Age of Ultron, released in 2015. There really isn't much wrong with this movie other than the anticlimactic end to its main antagonist. Ultron was very entertaining, but in the end, he came off as a bit weak to me. Still, I'd say he's around a top 10 MCU villain. The additions of Wanda and Pedro were definitely high points, and the Avengers were fantastic as always. The story's pretty Hawkeye heavy, which you wouldn't usually expect, but I enjoyed it a lot. I also enjoyed the scenes with Wanda projecting haunting visions in the minds of the Avengers, and those are probably the most memorable scenes of this film for me. This is also the last film in the MCU with Hulk being a serious monster before they leaned into the humorous side of the character in later films. Number 19, we have Loki Season 1, released in 2021. I was really excited going into the series to see how they continued to build Loki's character, and I was glad to see that he didn't end up faking his death again after Infinity War. The things this series added to the MCU were huge in expanding the multiverse of the franchise, and it was really interesting seeing Loki be at the center of all of it, alongside his new love interest, Sylvie, and I just think it's perfect that Loki would fall in love with a variant version of himself. All the other variant Lokis we meet, specifically classic Loki, were great, and I love how the season built up to the introduction of He Who Remains. Jonathan Majors immediately stole the show in the finale, and Season 1's ending really has me looking forward to what will happen in Season 2, and I hope they continue to explain his motives and everything else behind the TVA. Number 18, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, released in 2017. Although it's still a great movie, it is a bit of a drop-off from the original Guardians of the Galaxy, mainly because we spent most of it without a villain or a purpose for them to fight. But I still think it's hilarious, especially anything involving Baby Groot, and the love story between Gamora and Star-Lord is captivating to me. Ego is a solid enough villain, but is mainly carried by Kurt Russell's performance, but the reveal of his villainy is one of my favorites. Surprisingly, Yondu is the star of this film, with him really coming into his own before his death, taking place in what I think is a great final act. Number 17, we have Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, released in 2021. Shang-Chi breathed new life into the MCU, introducing their first new character solo film in 2 years. And unlike Captain Marvel 2 years before, I feel that it really hit the mark. Shang-Chi and side characters Katie and his sister Xia Ling were very likable, but his father Wen Wu, aka the real Mandarin, was the star of the film. I would definitely put him up there as a top 5 MCU villain because of how you can really sympathize with him. Like I said before, the fake Mandarin Trevor Slattery was a welcome return for me, as he, along with the characters named before and many others, combined to give this movie one of the strongest cast of characters within the entire MCU. The story is quite simple though, so it makes things slightly predictable. However, I still find it very entertaining. Number 16 is Black Panther, released in 2018. Here's another top 5 villain, as Killmonger may have the best motivations of any villain in the MCU. Chadwick Boseman puts in an amazing performance and makes you really feel the significance of the message Killmonger is sending to him. Killmonger's perspective is unusually empathetic, making him a complex watch as you want to root for his beliefs, but not the way he's fighting for them. And although T'Challa is able to defeat him and reclaim the throne, he's so impacted by Killmonger that he changes his beliefs to reflect those of his enemy. The side characters are also solid, and really this is an all-around great movie. At number 15, we have WandaVision Season 1, released in 2021. WandaVision's first few episodes are very different when you compare it to the rest of the MCU, and that's in part what makes them so good. The series gives us an in-depth look at Wanda's psyche through the hex she created to deal with the grief of losing the man she loved, Vision. I love the dynamic between Wanda and Vision, and it helps that Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany are such talented actors with amazing chemistry. This was a great final step for Wanda to finally become the Scarlet Witch, and I hope that she finds her happiness. Maybe with the other Vision introduced in the series, or maybe with the help of the Darkhold she's seen reading in the post-credits scene. And number 14 is The Avengers, released in 2012. I remember hearing about The Avengers everywhere when it first came out, and I'm disappointed that it took me 7 years to actually end up watching it. Watching the original Avengers interacting with one another for the first time is incredible, and it's nice to go back and watch this knowing how their relationships have grown since. Loki was the perfect first Avengers level threat, and is a top 3 MCU villain in my opinion, mostly due to Tom Hiddleston being amazing in the role. And although it took some time for some characters to really come into their own, specifically Thor, I think nearly everyone was at their best in this film, especially Hulk. Although Hulk might be funnier in other films, I think this film perfectly balanced the funny and frightening sides of the character, and Mark Ruffalo was great as Bruce Banner as well. We get to see Hawkeye and Black Widow's friendship for the first time in this one, as well as the first interactions between Iron Man and Cap that really do a great job of foreshadowing their encounters in later films and just their character arcs as a whole. At number 13, we have Ant-Man, released in 2015. I love Paul Rudd as Ant-Man. Then again, I just love Paul Rudd in general, but he's helped make Ant-Man one of my favorite superheroes from any superhero franchise. I love the connection built between Scott and his daughter in this movie, as well as his relationship with Hope. I also enjoyed seeing the history of the Ant-Man suit unravel throughout the film, and gave me a good understanding of why Hank would just give a burglar his Pym Tech. And in my opinion, Darren Cross, aka Yellowjacket, was a solid villain and had motivations that made sense. Ant-Man is one of the funniest movies in the MCU, and I think has to be up there as one of the best superhero origin stories. Number 12, we have Iron Man, released in 2008. Another film that's definitely up there as one of the greatest superhero origin stories. Iron Man changed the way that people perceive the superhero genre. Robert Downey Jr. is as perfect for this role as anyone has ever been for a role before, and he perfectly encapsulates who Tony Stark is. From the beginning to the end of this movie, there is so much to be entertained by, and although the villain isn't anything special, it's far from bad. As a standalone movie in comparison to the rest of the MCU, it may feel middle of the pack, but the influence it had on the entire genre holds its legacy up as one of the best of all time. And number 11 is Spider-Man Far From Home, released in 2019. We've gone over Far From Home, as well as the 2 other Spider-Man films in the MCU, in our Every Spider-Man Movie Ranked video, which you should go check out if you haven't already. And like we said before, this movie isn't perfect, but it's very entertaining. Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal put in great performances, and I think the twist revealing Mysterio to actually be a supervillain was very well done. But a main issue I have with this movie is that it was hard for me to suspend my disbelief when it came to the illusions Mysterio was able to create with the drones, even in the MCU. But the fight scenes involving Spider-Man and the drones looked incredible, and the film was very entertaining. The love story and side characters were also really strong, and it all came together by the end. And it was followed by a great cliffhanger in the mid-credits scene that would go on to set up No Way Home. At number 10, we have Spider-Man Homecoming, released in 2017. I love the high school environment in Homecoming, and it was great seeing Peter acting as a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man for a good bit. Michael Keaton was perfect as the Vulture, and really was just as great as any other live-action Spider-Man villain. And the twist revealing Toomes to be Peter's love interest to Liz's father was fantastic. as well as the car ride scene following it where Toomes realizes Peter's secret identity. I also loved the scene where Peter is buried under basically an entire building by Toomes, and although he calls for help at first, he realizes that he is the help and powers his way through the rubble. And I personally think Iron Man was great to be a father figure for Peter, and Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. had great chemistry with one another. At number 9 is Captain America: The First Avenger, released in 2011. The First Avenger is such a different style from the rest of the MCU. To me, Steve Rogers through the entire MCU might just be the most well-developed character, as well as the most interesting. Here he's as vanilla as it gets, and to me it's charming, but seeing him grow into the character he does later in the series makes me remember this version even more fondly. And the end of this film had me crying every time I thought about it for weeks. At number 8 we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier, released in 2014. I really liked the shift in Cap's character and way of thinking in this movie. He goes from being an obedient soldier at the start of it to questioning authority by the end. This sequel perfectly builds off the previous Captain America film, especially when it comes to the relationship between Steve and this movie's main antagonist, the Winter Soldier, aka Steve's former best friend, Bucky Barnes. Not only was this a really well put together story, but there were plenty of memorable moments as well. From the elevator fight scene to the final fight between Steve and Bucky, with Steve calling back to the same quote Bucky said to him in a flashback shown previous, saying he's with him till the end of the line. At number 7 we have Doctor Strange, released in 2016. Chris actually says he remembers this being the first movie he saw in the MCU, and after revisiting it years later, it's become one of our favorites within the series. Stephen Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is a captivating and flawed hero who goes through so much in a film that breezes by. The villains are a bit weak, but they aren't really the focus of the film, unlike most Marvel movies, because this is a deep character study of an egotistical man that gets put in check before finding a new life and being forced to prove himself worthy of it. At number 6 is Captain America: Civil War, released in 2016. I almost consider Civil War an Avengers film since a majority of them are in it, but it's still definitely a Captain America story and is an important step forward in the growth of his character, as well as Iron Man's. I really enjoyed seeing Ant-Man, Black Panther, and of course Spider-Man introduced to and teaming up with the other Avengers, and it was really interesting to see the Avengers fight amongst one another. I think Zemo was honestly a really good villain, and his plan was really well laid out to force the Avengers to turn on one another. There were a few memorable moments in this film as well, including the introduction of Tom Holland's Peter Parker and his interactions with Tony Stark and Cap, and the introduction of Black Panther. In my opinion, this is the best version of Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther, even though he was of course great in his solo film. But every single character really shined in this movie, and it did a great job of building up everyone, especially its central characters. At number 5 we have Thor Ragnarok, released in 2017. Thor Ragnarok is the funniest movie in the MCU, and it finally allows Chris Hemsworth to really prove himself with the character. The tone of this movie was so different from that of the previous 2 Thor films, and the result was the best version of Thor we'd seen up to that point. This is also the second best version of Hulk that we'd seen, behind the version seen in the Avengers. Loki was once again great, and new characters such as the Grandmaster, Valkyrie, and Korg were all entertaining in their own ways. Hela is a top MCU villain as well, and the reveal of Asgard's past was a great way to put over her motivations. The final battle was also great and didn't outstay its welcome, finishing with a satisfying conclusion and a perfect segue into Infinity War. At number 4 is Guardians of the Galaxy, released in 2014. This is the second funniest movie in the MCU, but it gets to the edge as the better movie over Ragnarok because of its seamless and entertaining team building, as well as an emotional climax. Groot, Rocket, Gamora, Drax, and Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, all come together to make the best team in the MCU. Obviously other than the Avengers, but they do give them a run for their money. These 4 are so different in character, but them working together is what's so entertaining. The villains are a bit weak, but again, that's not the point of this movie. What matters is how it builds up 4 very different characters and forces them to work together, and it really comes together in near perfection. At number 3 we have Spider-Man: No Way Home, released in 2021. Quick spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen No Way Home, and if you want to keep watching the video while skipping over this part, just skip to the time on the screen. We've already talked about how great No Way Home was in our Every Spider-Man Movie Ranked video, which once again you should go check out, so I'll try to keep this brief. Seeing the villains from the Raimi trilogy and Amazing Spider-Man films reprise their roles was incredible to witness, and among their great performances, I'd say the standouts were Willem Dafoe, Alfred Molina, and Jamie Foxx, with the latter being given one of the best character reinventions of the entire MCU. Tom Holland had the best performance of his career, and his chemistry with the other Spider-Man was great, and seeing Andrew and Tobey return as Spider-Man was one of, if not the, best moment of any superhero movie, with Andrew in particular really stealing the show. And we completely forgot to mention in our last ranking video that we got to see Charlie Cox make his MCU debut as Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, which was of course great. Like we said before, there's a lot of fan service in this movie, but I think there's just as much incredible storytelling to go along with it. At number 2 we have Avengers Endgame, released in 2019. Avengers Infinity War and Endgame are really more like 1A and 1B, but for the sake of simplicity, we have Endgame at number 2. We get to see the OG Avengers following their defeat against Thanos, with many of them losing their loved ones in the blip, and how it affects each of them differently. I like how simple they portray the discovery of time travel to be, and I really enjoyed the events that take place as they travel through time, such as Cap, Iron Man, and Ant-Man working together during the Battle of New York, Nebula being discovered by a 2014 variant of Thanos, and the heartbreaking scene between Clint and Natasha, with Natasha sacrificing herself for the Soul Stone. And seeing Iron Man, Cap, and Thor team up and get their asses kicked by Thanos was great, and led up to some of the best scenes of the entire MCU, such as Cap wielding Mjolnir, the return of the rest of the Avengers lost in the blip, and of course, the sacrifice of Tony Stark to wipe out Thanos and his army. This movie makes me cry basically every time, and I'm only slightly ashamed to admit it, but it really is just that good, and I highly recommend anyone that hasn't already to watch the MCU just to see this movie, as well as number 1, Avengers Infinity War, released in 2018. Infinity War is really just a masterpiece and builds up its main antagonist as good as any movie I've seen. And really, this film is more of a Thanos story than an Avengers story, but I mean that in the absolute best way. Thanos is one of my all-time favorite characters in film, and it felt like everything he said and did was memorable in Infinity War and Endgame. The Avengers were obviously great as well, and this movie really used the build from the previous movies so perfectly. And I loved seeing the Avengers finally interact with the Guardians of the Galaxy for the first time, especially the interactions between Star-Lord and Iron Man, even if Star-Lord did mess everything up in the end. And every single death in this film was perfect, from Loki to Gamora to everyone that was snapped out of existence by Thanos at the end, with Spider-Man's being the most heartbreaking of them all. Once again, every character was able to shine in this one, and everyone continued their growth from their own individual films, which is really a lot harder than I think most people realize, and it was one of the many reasons why Infinity War takes our number 1 spot. But those were our rankings of every MCU movie and show to date. We'll put our personal rankings on the screen, mine on the right and Chris's on the left, in case you're curious to see how my rankings compare to Chris's, and how both of our rankings compare to your own. If you liked this video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what rankings you want to see next. We'll make another one of these at the end of the year, so be prepared for our rankings to change drastically. But once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.